Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wen-Chi Yu. The Council on Foreign Relations recently released a task force report on US-Taiwan relations in a new era. Today, we're honored to have the task force co-chair, Admiral Michael Mullen. He's a former chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officer and advisor to the U.S. president from 2007 to 2011. Welcome, Admiral.
Good to be with you, Winch.
I want to begin by saying I wish we had a lot more time to talk about your incredible 4 decades of military service, from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan to the killing of Osama bin Laden. But today, we're going to focus on Taiwan, US, and the Indo-Pacific region, a growing challenge with a more assertive China. The CFR report assumes the status quo across the Taiwan Strait is unsustainable, primarily because of Xi Jinping's desire to take over Taiwan. And China says the opposite. It says it is the US and Taiwan that are changing the status quo. How do you respond to that?
I think that's the essence of the challenge right now. In many ways, we're just talking by each other. And that's what part of what we hope this report would do, would stimulate an engagement across a host of issues inside this very, very complex issue that is Taiwan. You mentioned my service. You know, I've actually spent quite a bit of time in the Pacific, I visited Taiwan in March of last year. It's the first time I'd been there since 1970. And when I was in the chairman's job from 2007 to 11, you know, I didn't spend any time on Taiwan. It wasn't that it wasn't a significant issue. It just wasn't on the plate because we had the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and a pretty significant terrorist threat, as you've indicated. That said, I believe now it is the center mass, if you will, the most significant issue between the U.S. And China. And I think that relationship is the most important relationship in this century. And I think it will continue to be driven mostly by the fact that these are the two largest economies in the world. And it appears, because we're talking past each other, to be getting worse and worse. And Taiwan is at the center of that. That's one of the reasons I agreed to co-chair this task force, so I could understand the issue in much more detail, which I think I do now, understand its incredible complexity, and try to depict in the report where we are and the danger that is there if the two leaders in these countries don't engage each other in a way to settle this out in a peaceful way.
Well, I think, as you said, status quo is at the essence of the issue, right? In China's mind, the status quo is temporary and has to lead to unification. However, as we know, peaceful unification seems less likely day by day. So if the status quo becomes a permanent separation, however you call it, and if the People's Liberation Army continues to grow its capabilities, do you think China will make the military move?
At some point in time, I suspect they will. Certainly with this leader, different from his predecessors, this leader being Xi Jinping, has made it pretty clear that we cannot continue specifically along the lines of where we've been. And China's been much more aggressive, actually in every sphere. The military moves get an awful lot of publicity, but China's been very aggressive and active in isolating Taiwan economically, diplomatically, politically, as well as militarily. The military operations are much more aggressive. It was my view when I visited Taiwan, and I still, even after studying this now for many months, is China has, in its coercive actions, has really imbalanced the area and the region. And we need to get back to a more balanced perspective. I think it's really important to emphasize from the U.S. perspective that the one China policy is still the policy. The whole goal of this is to see China and Taiwan reconcile this issue and do it in a peaceful way. Our President Biden's been pretty clear, even though his words have been pulled back, that he's going to be there to support Taiwan. President Xi has been pretty clear in his words to get his military ready by 2027. Essentially, this can no longer be passed on to his relief. He needs it to achieve the quote unquote Chinese rejuvenation. And I think we underestimate the significance, particularly we in America, underestimate the significance of history here. China went through a very bad time over 100 years ago. And this is almost, to listen to Xi Jinping, this is almost the last piece of the puzzle, if you will, to rectify that very, very bad time. So all that's very serious. Those are very serious concerns that Xi Jinping and other Chinese leaders have focused on. The main focus from our perspective is whatever the resolution, it needs to be done peacefully. One other point that is really significant is the context, and I hope people will read this report, because the context has changed so much over the last 50 or 60 years. And that, including the idea that independence is important for the Taiwanese people, that democracy is important for the Taiwanese people, that Taiwan is a booming economy centered on the semiconductor industry, not just for Taiwan or for China or the US, but for the world. So lots of things have changed from when this policy was originally put in place, which makes it that much more critical that these issues be resolved peacefully.
Well, I'm glad that you said the context has changed so much, right? We know the sort of cornerstone of US-Taiwan relations, it's really based on the Taiwan Relations Act, which was, almost 40 years ago, or actually more than 40 years ago. Right. And so China has changed a lot. Taiwan has changed a lot. The US has changed a lot. And so, certainly I think all sides are right to say the other sides are not sticking to the principles that were agreed upon 4 decades ago or even later. Now, the Chinese ambassador Xie Feng said during his interview at Aspen Security Forum just a few days ago that Taiwan is a non-negotiable issue. Quote unquote, he says, it's like a gray rhino charging at us. He meant the US-Taiwan policy, and he expressed his concern about how much pro-separatist rhetoric from some Taiwanese leaders was influencing American leaders. Here we see again, China is framing Taiwan as advocating for separation or independence. To be honest, this is very likely to be the justification for any Chinese military move toward Taiwan. And so if China perceives support for Taiwan's status quo as support for Taiwan's permanent separation or even independence, what else can be done to secure Taiwan? Are we just buying time?
Well, I believe for some time, long before this report actually, that if any Chinese leader, including this one, Xi Jinping, thought Taiwan would either declare independence or would be independent, that they would take military action to make sure that didn't happen. And I think that will continue to be the case. Based on my trip out there a year ago, March, I was reminded, because I hadn't been there in so long, there's a lot of politics in Taiwan as well. Right. And President Ing-wen of the DPP has certainly leaned in the direction, the independent direction, for Taiwan. There is an election in January, and the current leader in terms of the DPP is Vice President Lai, has been pretty vocal about moving in the independence direction as well. He hasn't declared it, but he's moved in that direction. And it really is important for Tsai Ing-wen as well as Lai to be very careful about their rhetoric, because it's a very dangerous situation and it could trip it. We haven't and shouldn't be. We, the U.S., have not been involved in Taiwanese elections and who gets elected. That really is up to the Taiwanese people, and that's really what democracy is all about. So any leader, whether it's from the KMT or from the DPP, every leader has to be very careful about the rhetoric, clearly given the situation and the level of intensity that we're in right now, which could be very dangerous. One of the really substantive parts of the report that you've talked about, and that co-chaired this task force, is that we really believed in the task force that deterrence of China is eroding. And that is not a good thing as well. And so we believe that the United States needs to take steps to restore the deterrent effect, if you will, to make sure that China doesn't think on any given day that it's a good idea to invade Taiwan or to take it militarily. That's a really critical step. The problem with that is because tensions are up, to get into what I would call this rebalance situation, steps that the United States may take, tensions are going to go up even higher. That's why Biden and Xi have to get together on this and stay together on this so that whatever steps are taken, war doesn't break out.
Well, as you said, the tensions are rising. And a big part of it is probably due to US domestic politics. Our own domestic rhetoric about China has not been disciplined, I would say. And as someone, who's been through different presidents and, decades of served in the US government military for decades, is this just getting worse in terms of, what maybe the administration would like to achieve? However, the public and the media is not being helpful.
I would encourage, and this is hard, but I would encourage those who listen to the rhetoric coming out of the United States to focus on what the administration says. I spent many, many years in government, the last certainly decade plus in Washington. And there's rhetoric coming from Capitol Hill on many issues, including this one. I have been struck, and it's not just about Taiwan. Globally, an awful lot of people read what congressman or senator X, Y, or Z say and take it as policy. And that's just not the case. It is a fact, and it makes solving this puzzle that much more difficult. Being opposed to China right now, being anti-China, is politically very effective and positive, if you will, from the political perspective for politicians. So on both sides of the aisle, Democrats and Republicans. And so you're going to hear that rhetoric. I would ask that, when you hear that rhetoric, not to react to it so heavily, because 9 times out of 10, it really is just rhetoric, and it's political rhetoric for their own constituents, for their own political gains, if you will, certainly over the course of the next year. And in that regard, if it's taken seriously, it could be very dangerous. It doesn't mean they don't have strong views about China in many areas. But at the same time, the real policy, and where the U.S. is right now is coming out of the White House, and I would pay attention to that.
Well, thank you for explaining that, because I don't think most people outside of even Washington, D.C. Would understand how to accurately interpret what is the real U.S. policy. I want to go back to a key debate in Washington, D.C. about whether China will invade Taiwan or not. Some believe it entirely hinges on PLA's capabilities, the People Liberation Army. Based on your experiences in other parts of the world, what's your view of capabilities and intent? So will Beijing invade Taiwan when the PLA is ready? And you mentioned the timeline, 2027, which was put out by the U.S. Defense Intelligence Community. Do you believe in that timeline?
When I'm asked about an invasion in Taiwan from China, there's only one person on earth that knows the answer to that question, and that's the president of China. That's Xi Jinping. So it's an unknown. I think he's been pretty clear to tell his military, the PLA, to be ready by 2027. Clearly, the investment in China, in its defense department, in its defense capability, has risen dramatically in the last couple of decades. So they're much more capable than they used to be. But one of the realities of the world we're living in right now is the war in Ukraine and Russia. And as someone who led our military during a couple of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, this is really hard stuff. Rarely do we get it right. China hasn't fought a significant war, really, since 1953, even though there was one in Vietnam, over a very brief period of time. So one of the things I believe, I don't know this, but I believe that Xi Jinping and his leadership team are looking at what's going on in Ukraine and must be sobered by what's happened so far, by the devastation that's there, that in Putin's case, it has gone so badly for him for lots of reasons. And to be I would be sitting there wondering how I would do. So these capabilities, the idea of an amphibious landing, if you will, in Taiwan to literally seize the island. It's the most complex military operation known to man, and so it will not be done easily. The Taiwanese defense capability is also increasing, very wary of what's going on with respect to China, and it's for all these reasons. And you know, we've talked in our report about the depression, the economic depression that would occur globally if there were a war in Taiwan. So everybody loses. It's not just China or the US. The globe loses, you know, if war breaks out over Taiwan. That's why leaders, responsible leaders on every side of this question have to figure out how to resolve this peacefully. It's absolutely critical that happen.
Yeah, I think, you know, the consequences are going to be so great, much greater than the Ukraine-Russia war, that no one probably would take it easily, lightly. But as we know, you know, most of the wars happen, you know, better than anyone else, not because of this, you know, clear cut, you know, I decide I am going to launch the war. Oftentimes it happens because of accidents. And so with both the US-led Western allies building up the defense and deterrence to protect Taiwan, and China doing the same, both in the name of defense rather than sort of, you know, launching attacks, what mechanisms need to be in place to make sure and preempt any potential accidents?
Well, this issue leads to the lack of communication between our militaries.
Yes, absolutely.
Recently, when Secretary Austin was in Shangri-La and at least shook General Lee's hand, which I thought was positive, and somewhat that, you know, if that's where we are, you know, in being positive, we got a long way to go. But my own experience is having the ability to pick up the phone and speak to each other in a crisis does a great deal to make sure that crisis doesn't spin out of control. There's a fairly long history here of China cutting off mill to mill. This last time it was cut off, it was as a result of Speaker Pelosi's visit last year to Taiwan. And I understand China doesn't want to do this because they don't want to, quote unquote, reward the United States. For me, this is not about a reward. This is a necessity to make sure we don't go to war. And I recognize even when we call each other, when communications are working, there has to be somebody there that can actually answer a question and that can make a decision. And we both have our own chains of command. Yeah. And I understand that. But there needs to, in a world that we're in right now, it needs to happen rapidly to making sure we de-escalate any situation. And China's recent actions, where one ship came very close to another ship, where a Chinese jet flew in front of one of our airplanes, those are really dangerous actions. I've spent a lot of time in my life in those kinds of situations. And you have to have skilled people making sure something really doesn't turn bad and somebody doesn't get killed in that kind of situation. Clearly, China has been very aggressive in the South China Sea in the last several years, built it up militarily against what Xi Jinping said he would do. So tensions are way up, and I think will continue to be up. From my perspective, the U.S. isn't going anywhere. And obviously China's not going anywhere. So we need to figure out how to operate in that part of the world, you know, in a peaceful way without endangering lives. Establishing over a period of time, you know, military to military communications to have these discussions, which we did throughout our time in the Cold War with the Soviets. We had multiple lines of communication open, is really critical. That's a learning. I'm not trying to win here.
Yes.
In terms of having communications, that's a learning from decades of being in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. And it really does work. So I hope we can figure out a way to make that happen without the U.S. gloating, because we wouldn't do this, that we have now established communications or somehow we won. It really is critical. And if we don't have mill-to-mill, we've got to have some other means of communication. Maybe it's state, maybe it's the foreign ministry to the State Department, but some way of talking to each other rapidly to de-escalate a situation that could spin out of control and result in a big war.
Well, you clearly agree that communication and just to be able to explain to each other in terms of intent and with clarity is important. But a major part of U.S. policy toward Taiwan is actually strategic ambiguity, which is a long-held U.S. policy toward Taiwan. We know that the CFR task force couldn't come to a consensus on this point. What is your view, and can you kind of explain the various perspectives that were presented in the report?
Part of what the report lays out, and I encourage people to read it, is the rich history of the evolution of this relationship and the policy. And I talked earlier about the context of it. And I think all of it kind of gets summed up far too easily. And is it
simplified?
Is it strategic ambiguity or strategic clarity? Yeah. This is me personally, I actually believe strategic ambiguity has worked. We've had 40 plus years of peace, and I am loath to change that personally until I just have a compelling piece of evidence or a compelling situation that says, look, now's the time. That we need to go to clarity. I just think, as you said, we're trying to simplify it, way too much. And somehow that if we make it a strategic clarity, that just helps a great deal. I just don't believe that. I think it complicates it. I personally think it's a step toward war. If we do that. And I recognize, there are pros and cons to both sides of this. So, and there wasn't significant disagreement. Admiral Harris was on the task force. He's been out publicly for a couple of years now, advocating for strategic clarity. What we tried to do in the report, in not addressing it, was to downplay the significance of that decision, if you will, or that policy, and encourage people. And people are busy and don't have time. There's a lot of information here to try to understand what's really going on. So I think people will continue to advocate for one position or another. I, for one, think strategic ambiguity has worked. We have retained, or we've sustained, a peaceful environment for over 4 decades, and that's where I still am.
Well, most of your career was in the Middle East, another region of its own complexity and difficulty. So looking at the Indo-Pacific today, are the challenges similar or different? And are there lessons learned from the Middle East that could be applied to the current deadlock across the Taiwan Strait?
The one lesson from the Middle East that I take away is war is really tough. And it doesn't oftentimes generate the outcomes that you want. So you need to be pretty careful about that. The Middle East, again, I also learned that really those countries that live there have to resolve their own problems. We can support them in that regard, but that's really critical. And that's kind of where I am right now in terms of even rising tensions there as we speak. But the huge difference between Indo-PACOM and the Middle East is, and I've said this for many years, the Indo-PACOM is the center of four of the 5 largest economies in the world. And again, and we've had peace and stability there for decades. And any outbreak of war in that part of the world is going to destabilize the world almost instantly. And that requirement to keep it stable, I think, is a compelling and overriding one for leaders of these countries. We also have alliances, long-standing alliances the US in that part of the world, with Japan, with South Korea, with Australia. And in that regard, we have obligations there that are also longstanding. And our allies want to know what we're going to do. And you can see in Australia and Japan in particular, they are now publicly much more supportive of stability in that region. And I wouldn't say they're willing to fight with us in the case of Taiwan, but certainly they're moving in that direction. They seek the kind of stability that we've had and are worried more and more about it, even as you see them build up their own defense budgets. So it's the most important region in the world. It will be for decades to come. And it's on all of us as leaders to make sure we do everything we possibly can to make sure war does not break out.
Well, last question. As much as we all, not want a war to break out, but will it happen or not? Well, very well Graham Allison's Thucydides trap destined for war between the US and China. And then you have Kevin Rudd's avoidable war. Which one do you believe?
I still think it's, I think they've both framed the range of possibilities, if you will. And I think it's more than anything else, and both are, I know both individuals well, and they're incredibly thoughtful individuals. I think more than anything else, not because either one of them have said this to me, what they have done is a service to tee up, if you will, the dangers that exist with respect to where we are right now, and to hopefully create thoughtful leadership globally, on these issues, to try to understand them in some depth, and also to try to understand how dangerous this is. I'm a kid of the 60s, if you will. I think it's the most dangerous time since 1962, honestly, which was the Cuban Missile Crisis here in the US. I would hope, for instance, and that was tied to nuclear weapons with Soviet Union, I would hope we could get into a conversation with China about nuclear weapons. They are developing that capability. It's an incredibly dangerous capability, and responsible powers historically, the Soviet Union and the US in particular, have engaged in treaties since the early 70s, quite frankly, to contain these weapons. That's just one example. So we live in a very, very dangerous time from my perspective. So I think what Rudd and Allison have done have framed it very well. It's on all of us, including them, to speak to these issues in a way that educate, so that leaders will make good decisions, so that we don't have that conflict that could literally destroy the world.
Well, thank you, Admiral, for speaking to TVBS Meeting Room today, and of course for co-chairing this report, which obviously is another tool of education to the general public.
Thanks.
Thank you again for your cautionary and wise words. Take care.
Yeah.